Is it Dr. Marksbury, Rick? What do you want to be known by?
I go by Rick.
Rick? Ed. Nice to meet you.
Hello, Ed.
Hi.
Well, anyhow, greetings. This is supposed to be Speak Free Radio, and this is Charles Lincoln with Ed LeBouthillier, and I don't know who the black fellow is. Black fellow.
That's my puppy Raven.
Raven. And you have some actual ravens there, as I recall. And tonight we are honored to have Rick Marksbury, Dean, former Dean of the University College and the Extension School at Tulane University, where he graduated with a Ph.D. in 1979, and I graduated with an MA the following year, with a BA rather, the following year, 1980. And Rick was the first graduate student I ever heard of in anthropology. He was absolutely the star of the department, and everybody was talking about Rick Marksbury. And so it's an incredible pleasure to have him here and introduce him to this audience. And I hope we eventually get on Speak Free Radio, because this is really weird. All the trouble we're having. Wait a minute. Somebody just wrote me, music still playing on Speak Free. YouTube has you shadow banned. I got notification for this only after I clicked on it myself.
Wow.
So this is interesting.
Welcome to the modern world.
Rick, you are with someone who's been banned from 5 different profiles on Facebook. I've never been banned from YouTube, actually. If I'm shadow banned, that's interesting.
The shadow ban being totally banned, or just a certain kind of ban? The shadow ban, is that a certain kind of a ban or no?
I don't know. What does it mean to you?
So shadow ban means that you're still there, but people won't be able to find you by searching for you and things like that.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Anyhow, we have had all sorts of glitches trying to set this up, and it's almost comical. I am more low tech than I'm sure that the people of Yap these days are much better at internet than I am. And I was just commenting to Ed, it's a long way from here to Yap.
It's a long way.
Have you been back since the 1970s?
I've been in different areas around there, but I never.
I can barely hear you now. I can barely hear you. We've got an audio problem.
Well, my mic was looking good. Is there anything I could do to?
That's much better. That's much better. I can hear you much better.
I've been around the area. I took students to Hawaii for about 15 years and been to Guam and other places, but I didn't go back to Yap. I had a chance to go back to Yap. I chose not to. And, I worked in modernization and development. When I was there, men were in loincloths and women in grass skirts and topless. And now they've got email and cell phones and blue jeans. And I just didn't want to go back and see it that way. So I chose not to.
I can kind of understand that. It'd be a weird kind of culture shock, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it really would. And especially I added to it because for all the years I taught, I showed slides of when I was there, the people and the dances and all this stuff. So the images were still there from 76 to 78. And so it's even added to that challenge of going back.
That's interesting. I mean, I feel much the same way about Yucatan. Everybody, the son, not the people who actually worked for me, but the children of the people, the Maya Indians who worked for me at Chichen Itza in the 1980s are now all on Facebook. Talk about weird.
Yeah.
The transformation of the third world is, I think, one of the more interesting things that's happened in our lifetimes. And that's, I guess it's it's really a major anthropological issue, and you and I have this background in a field which really doesn't prepare people to be on shows like this at all. We are basically advocates for something that most people would consider antithetical to anthropology, aren't we?
Today, that's true. That's
Yeah.
true. The band people, the hunters and gatherers, disappeared on the planet by 1950, and we don't talk about it. But the tribal peoples are really almost gone on the planet. Real tribal people, very few exist, and they'll be gone within 20 years. Period. It's over for that.
What do you? How do you? I mean, do you feel? I mean, I have told this to Ed several times. I feel like I suffer from a major case of cognitive dissonance between my anthropological self and my cultural political self. Do you get that feeling at all?
Well, I think, first of all, I think the field today is entirely different than the way I was educated, and I think the way you're educated. I don't think it exists anymore. Cultural relativity is dead. Ethnocentrism is dead. It's not taught because it's not politically correct to teach either of those two things, but that's the way we were taught.
I'm
That
an
was the foundation
ethnocentrist.
of anthropology.
You're what, Ed?
I said I'm an ethnocentrist.
Well,
Well,
I taught for 43 years in every single class. I ask about ethnocentrism. I say, it's pan-human. It's one of the few things that is pan-human. Everybody's ethnocentric. And if you begin with that premise that we're all ethnocentric, explains an awful lot. But we tend to ignore it.
Yeah. And I was going to say, I think one way that you as a anthropologist can resolve those feelings you were talking about is to say, I've got a culture too, and acknowledge your own culture.
well, Rick, in fact, has become an advocate for one of the most endangered and targeted cultures on Earth right now, namely the heirs and admirers of the Southern Confederacy of the United States. Do you feel like an endangered species?
Me? Yes. Oh, absolutely. I was never really involved in anything like that I got involved in, mostly because I just was apolitical. Even though I don't know if you read what I sent you today, Charles, but
I didn't get a chance to read it in detail. No, I saw that you were in Yap, and I was just thinking that's a long way off.
Now, what I did somehow, it's just me on the picture. I don't know why. I'm just looking at myself
because I focused on you. I'll do that.
Okay.
I'll bounce back and forth. It makes it visually more interesting to bounce back and forth.
Okay, so back to what was going on. Just really minding my business. My family, my dad's side of the family, came to the colonies in 1672, and had relatives fight on both sides of the Civil War. But this family settled in Virginia and Kentucky. So I wasn't involved. I've never been a joiner, like the Sons of Confederate Veterans, never. So I was going on my family vacation to Gatlinburg, 2015, and my son Daniel, who's always ahead of the game, he's probably the most informed person I know, said, "Dad, they're going to take down the Robert E. Lee Monument when we're in Tennessee." I said, "That will never happen. What are you talking about?" And so then I got involved. And I joined the Sons of Confederate Veterans. I filed 3 lawsuits. I challenged Mitch Landrieu on WWL radio to a public debate. He wouldn't do it. And I became the face of keeping the monuments up. I was on sabbatical. New York Times came down and did a Sunday piece on me. BBC came in, ABC, Fox News. I was everywhere. Tulane hated it. So I did get involved, and I saw all the lies, all the manipulations. Landrieu, just did this for political gains. you know, the Southern Poverty Law Center got involved, and I saw what they're doing, and it's just all, you know, just so many lives. It's incredible. The lack of knowledge, the lack of history. The last paper, the last student newspaper at Tulane, while I was there, I was on the front page with a picture of a Confederate monument, and the title was, the only story on the front page was, Tulane professor has pro-Confederate ties. I mean,
I got about 100 copies of that. I got about 100 copies of that copy of the Hullabaloo. I'm saving them.
Well, if you look, Charles, online and you see the comments, I think 52 people commented and 51 backed me. You know, it was just a hit job. And that's so, you know, I got Antifa threatened me at my house. I had to go file a police report. They tried to dox me, but, you know, back in those days, I didn't do anything. I had no social media. My deal was on Facebook. I didn't do Insta. I didn't do any of those things. So nobody could dox me. And I challenged them because, you know, I was a professor at Tulane, a dean at Tulane. I got a Ph.D. in anthropology, and they kind of just, you know, backed off. But Tulane University changed. Wasn't the place I was. When I came back off sabbatical, I was a pariah. You know, nobody really wanted to talk to me because how dare I, you know, argue about Confederate monuments. But I wasn't really arguing about Confederate monuments. I was arguing about taking down any monuments. And a good friend of mine, you know, Margie Esmond, you know, who you know, Charles?
Yes, I do.
Margie, you know, she got her Ph.D. from Tulane in anthropology and then got a law degree. And she was the executive director of the ACLU for Louisiana for many, many years. But she was always one of my good friends. And she wrote something in the paper, and so I countered her. And I wrote a piece early on that it was a slippery slope. The presidents would be next. And Margie sat there. That'll never happen. They're not going to go after the presidents. They're not going to go after Jefferson in Washington. But of course they did. And it just continues.
Culture war.
It's a fairly grim culture war, and Rick has written some interesting pieces, including the last time I think I saw Rick in person, he was presenting an early draft of a paper I see on his curriculum vitae now about basically the lost cause, and I'd like you to talk about that a little bit, because I have to admit, it really bothered me that you were saying that the lost cause was a revitalization movement. It's going to sound strange, but I guess it wounded my pride to think that we were like the Indians at Wounded Knee, or the John from Cargo Cult in Micronesia, and yet as an endangered species on the way out. I think it's an interesting comparison.
I think it's, Charles, I think it's spot on, actually. I think we've looked at it too narrow of a focus. You know, Anthony Wallace, who really came up with the whole thing in anthropology, I don't think he was that narrow. People that suffer trauma and traumatic events that affect their culture and their society.
I'm losing you. Your sound is going away.
All right. People who suffer traumatic events in their culture, in their society, one of the ways they heal is to turn to nostalgia. And in fact, interestingly enough, in the Civil War, one of the terms that doctors used to refer to what we today call PTSD was nostalgia. And people who treat PTSD patients today realize that one of the healing things is nostalgia. So that's what the lost cause is, which is what almost all of the revitalization movements are. All of them are looking back to the ancestors, to the earlier times before Western contact, before war. A German historian, cultural historian, wrote a book. It's called The Culture of Defeat. And in the culture of defeat, that's a revitalization movement. He spoke about the lost cause as a culture of defeat. He talked about France after the Franco-Prussian War. And he also talks about National Socialism as a culture of defeat that came about in the 30s because of the way everything happened after the First World War. So I think revitalization movements are more common than we think. What I talked with my students over the years was, I think the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King was a revitalization movement. Methodism was a revitalization movement. And now I'm starting to think even more about the MAGA movement. Trump's MAGA movement, to me, is a revitalization movement. It fits everything. You know, you've got a prophet, you've got people that have felt that they've been left out of everything, and they're trying to come to grips with it. You know, it's cargo cult or MAGA. The goals are, I think, all the same, trying to get back to where we were before all this trauma happened. So the lost cause is a perfect example. Southern society was destroyed. You know, 1 out of 4 men between 20 and 40 were dead. You know, hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. They had nothing to go to. Then they're living under occupation with the federal army. So the only thing they could do to heal them was to talk about things in the past, talk about part of the antebellum period, to deal with memorials. You know, it's a perfect revitalization movement. Well, what I've learned is the power of those who have made their reputation, their tenure, their raises, being on TV and books. You know, I can't get this thing published, so I keep working on it because the powers that be, and I can name them, they don't have anything to do with it. It's not a myth at all. The lost cause evolved into different forms, but it's not folk tales. It's not a myth. It's not a lie. It's not false. It's not all of these things. It's a pure revitalization movement, and it was a successful one because Southern culture, white Southern culture, was preserved, and
until now,
it worked.
There is a way of getting around things that's, I don't know that I would call it a revitalization movement, and that is to embrace a kind of idealism for a new kind of future, accepting the past, accepting the present, and just setting new ideals for where you want things to go in the future. I don't know if that's quote unquote revitalization so much as redirecting.
Well, I mean, there's a formula in a sense that's laid out, and everything can be adjusted with the formula. With the revitalization movement, you've had a culture that's dying or it's threatened either by invasion, by warfare, by colonialism, by plagues, by tornadoes that destroy communities. When people suffer trauma and they want to go back, no, but in true revitalization, normally there's somebody that they'll call a prophet, somebody that says, this is the way we go. Ghost Dance had a prophet. The Lost Cause had a prophet. Gentleman rose the rise and fall of the Confederacy. He's told the Southerners, we've lost the battle, but we won't lose the war of ideas. He said we can still win the war of ideas. And so he kind of laid it out. And if you look at, the things that the German cultural historian, if you look at National Socialism,
who is this culture historian? Because I was trying to look him up and I can't find it. A culture of deceit gets all sorts of different things.
The culture of defeat, D-E-F-E-A-T.
Oh, defeat. I thought you said the culture of deceit. Okay.
No, defeat, because the whole idea was that this is a movement. He calls it the culture of defeat. And I've talked to other anthropologists. They kind of like that concept.
Wolfgang Schivelbusch.
That's right. Schivelbusch.
Wolfgang Schivelbusch. Okay.
But he uses 3 examples in his book because I said those 3. So yeah, I think there's different aspects of it. I think there's revitalization and I think that's it. If there's a prophet out there, I think it's a movement that, again, I imagine throughout humankind, when societies have been destroyed and people want to look back at the good times the way they were before, there's probably been hundreds of them, thousands of them.
So from my perspective, I don't know if you know my name, LeBouthillier. I have history in the French Canadian culture, and the French Canadians have revitalized their culture, or at least they did up to a point. And they were pretty dynamic and forward-looking and moving forward. So I believe that it's not always just "quote unquote" looking back, but redirecting where you are. You know,
Well,
go ahead.
that's true, but in Quebec, they value their language, they value their culture. You know, they do all of that,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And they got a big boost. I think it was in '68 or '69 when Charles de Gaulle came over and addressed the people of Quebec and said, "Vive le Québec libre."
But it's not
That's
only the Quebecois. There's also the Acadians. The
That's right.
Cajuns.
Well,
you know
speaking of Cajuns, Cajun in Louisiana, the Acadian culture in Louisiana was dying. Codafil came in to try to bring it into the schools. The language was dying. It wasn't being taught. So many things were dying.
Yeah.
And then one person comes about, and I'm going to put him as a prophet, Paul Prudhomme. Paul Prudhomme brought Cajun culture and Cajun cooking to the country. And it was a total rebirth. You can go to Seattle and eat in a Cajun restaurant. Prudhomme put his arms around Cajun culture and the Acadian culture and brought it way back out. So to me, that's kind of another idea of a revitalization movement. He was a prophet. And he brought that culture back to the mainstream, television, food shows, everything. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about is these kinds of movements when people feel their culture, their way of life is threatened.
Yes. But I mean, every culture encounters that, I would argue. You know, every culture in every age encounters threats and risks, and it's how they adapt themselves and mobilize themselves and move forward that determines whether they survive or disappear into history.
You're
You know,
100%. That's 100% right. Their choices are give up and die, assimilate, or try to hold on to something.
right.
You know, those are the choices you get when you're faced with that kind of drastic culture change.
Well, right now it appears that the majority of the people, the white people in the South, are either giving up and dying or assimilating. Is that your perspective also?
No.
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 Okay, tell me what signs you see of something different, because I mean maybe in Spanish Fort, Alabama, things look a little bit brighter than they do here in Uptown New Orleans, but in Uptown New Orleans it's so amazing to me this. I don't know if you remember what I wrote when they were talking about taking down the monuments. I said if you want to eliminate all the monuments to slavery in New Orleans, nuke the city. That was my that was where I said it, because this is a city that was built on slavery and the heritage of the Old South. And I remember back in the '70s how every little tourist store in the French Quarter had Confederate battle flags for sale, stickers, pins, everything.
Charles, my answer would be that those people that you see versus so many of the ones I think I see is I think people are terrified. They're terrified. I've gotten hundreds of emails when I was out in the public eye, people supporting me. There's, I won't say it's underground, but it's kind of underground. I think there's a lot of things in this country that are underground, people just waiting for the right moment. People are afraid to fly the Confederate flag, or one of the Confederate flags, the battle flag, especially. Nobody knows what the national flags are. They're fearful. We see from the press that people lose their jobs. You know, they get fired, they get demoted, they get doxxed. So I think there's fear out there, but deep down, I think what I've said and I thought 8 years ago, and I still do, that the Antifa people, the left, the Marxists, the way they want to change the country, the biggest thing that's standing in their way is the South. I did a Google search several years ago when I was working on the culture wars thing. I just did it and I said, Southern culture, Western culture, Midwestern culture, New England culture. And, I don't remember the numbers, for example, but Midwest, maybe 30,000, New England, maybe 40,000, Western, maybe 50,000, South, 450,000.
Wow.
The South is where there's still pockets of people. The South is where so many of those monuments were. And I think the idea here is if we can destroy the South, the rest of the country is easy to take. It is the solid South. We can see that's where it is politically. And it's a bastion that puts things up. I mean, this state, I'm now in Alabama. Louisiana kind of chickened out. Alabama's pretty strong. Tennessee's pretty strong. There are a lot of groups. There are people out there that believe in those things. And at least, see, it's kind of like when you're doing field work or something, you seek certain people out, you know, and I find these people easy and they're all around. And I think they're just waiting for something, you know, to change it. I just do.
Well, and so I would like to counter a little bit, because just because a movement occurs, I mean, I'm just talking about movements in general, about a people that have some sort of historical tradition or culture or identity. I would argue it doesn't necessarily make it a revitalization movement. I mean, there are, well, in the way that you were mentioning, that there's a strong leader or whatever. I mean, there have been a number of social movements which are just people getting militant about embracing their identity and their culture and moving forward like that. In the United States, I mean, there were Puerto Rican movements that have done that. There was the Black is Beautiful movement that where that was done. In the Southwest, there was the Hispanic, what was it, Aztlan movement.
Well, Ed, do you know the name of the biggest ever Hispanic political party?
You're talking about, no, not political party. You're saying in the U.S. or
in the U.S.? Yeah.
No, I'm not familiar.
Rick, do you remember La Raza Unida?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
La Raza Unida. I love to translate that into German for people. Völkische Einheit.
Yeah.
It sounds very different, doesn't it? But La Raza Unida cannot be translated into German any other way.
But social movements are always occurring, and people, they lose authority, they lose self-determination, and then they revitalize themselves, they redirect themselves, they get militant about their viewpoints, their identity, and their culture, and then they form something new.
Well, Ed, yes, you're right, but I think maybe I didn't explain it well enough. It's all rectiles are square, but all squares aren't rectiles.
No, I understand what you're saying. There's a pattern.
The lost cause is a social movement, but not all social movements are lost causes. The lost cause doesn't exist today. I'm talking about after the Civil War, but it was one that was successful. Most lost causes end in total failure.
Yes.
Because their goals are unachievable. Like in the ghost dance, we'll be invincible to the white man's bullets. Well, that didn't work.
Nope.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree with you as well. And to me, our job is to form social movements which put our cultural values to primacy and give them the highest authority in our lives. And the way we're going to do that is, like I said, become militant about our culture and our identity and reject the authority of people outside of our culture in defining who and what we are and how we should be living our lives. I mean, that's more of a political statement than a sociological statement, but I believe, anthropology, sociology, these can help understand how political movements can form, how they should be operating, and we should use those ideas.
And that's really one of the reasons that I'm hoping that I can persuade Rick possibly to be a regular with us, because I have been thinking very heavily about the role of anthropology in deconstruction of basically the basis for political dialogue and myths. And as he says, the lost cause as a revitalization movement, at least in the late 19th and early 20th century, was a success because it was adopted into politics. It became basically the reason for existing of the Democratic Party of the South. I mean, it's hard to believe it, but the Southern Democrats were in Alabama What was that? What was their motto up until 1966 on the ballot? Do you know, Rick?
Not offhand, no.
Until 1966, on the Alabama and I believe Mississippi and Georgia ballots, the Democratic Party was a rooster holding a banner saying "White supremacy for the right." It was actually George Wallace who took that off the ballot, ironically enough. Or maybe it was Lurleen, actually. It might have been his wife who served as one term as governor. He was basically term limited out. But white supremacy for the right was, it was also celebrated here in Louisiana with the, on the battle, the first monument to come down was the monument to the Battle of Liberty Place. And that made express reference to basically white supremacy, and that's why it was targeted first. How do you feel about that aspect of the politics of the revitalization movement?
Well, that's true. I mean, the lost cause as a revitalization movement, the foundation was white supremacy. That's what it was going in. That's what it was coming out. And when Reconstruction ended, by that time, they were geared up to take over the political framework of what used to be the Confederacy and incorporate those things into their constitutions, into their voting principles as well. So there's no question. One of the reasons the movement, if we will, was successful was because you're right, Charles, it was incorporated into the political framework and it was controlled that way.
And how today, and this is what Ed and I are always talking about. Ed and I, by the way, we are members of the board of something almost non-existent called the American Freedom Party. It's a very small group of people that basically numbers at most in the hundreds, it's not much of a movement. But if we were ever to expand, we would need, and if we were ever to realize what you're saying, we would need something to support it in the way of an ideology and a motivational myth. And you say that you think that the South is still alive because everybody is fascinated by it, I guess, right? Am I representing what you said correctly in terms of the Google searches?
I think, I'm not sure I'd use the word fascination, but I guess when that could apply. I just think when you talk about Southern culture, it has a strong meaning. It has had a strong meaning. I mean, again, in that paper on the lost cause that I did, the South was the other. They were the other. Northerners saw the South as very different people. When the war started, the Southerners were called in the newspapers vermin and non-human. And one of the reasons the North used total war on them because they could feel that they could eliminate them. So the South was always seen as something different. Most sociologists will even talk about the Southerners being different, Southern culture being different. And there are works out there that suggest that white and black Southerners have more in common with one another than black Southerners do with Northern blacks. So I think there is a strong piece to Southern culture. I think people take a lot of pride in it. I don't think that same pride level exists for Midwestern.
That's interesting.
Western culture, perhaps not the West Coast, but the Western culture, the Rockies and everything, maybe so.
What's your perspective on the anthropology of race in the role in the South today?
The anthropology of race?
Yes. Or the sociology of race, any way you want to frame it, or the semiotics of race, however you want to describe it.
Well, the way I teach it, the way I teach it, Charles, I'll back up. I'm a strong believer in biology, in human evolution and biology. When Australian Aborigines meet one another historically on the path, and they did not recognize the other person, They sit down and they try to find if they're related. They talk about their clans and their totems, hopefully to find out this person is a relative and not an enemy. Because if you're not a relative, you're an enemy, which probably goes back to the early days that humankind came about. Well, if you're a white person and you see a black person on the path, you don't have to think for a second that they're a relative. They're the enemy. So if you accept that as something towards human survival and adaptation, that we're fearful of people that don't look like us, kind of like a phobia, xenophobia is certainly something that's real. It's probably something that's pan-human and it's been around forever. Then I think there's a basis for racism to be biological. I think there's cultural as well, but you can't ignore biology in such things. And I think if we look at quote unquote those tribal peoples on the planet, or the old band people, we'll understand that if you're not a relative, you're the enemy, period. And so that's what I teach my students and always have. And I ask them, I said, so therefore anybody can be a racist, right? And most of the times my student will agree. Then they'll say, yeah, you're right. So that's the perspective I have. I wish people would look at race differently instead of it's just a total cultural phenomenon. Try to figure out why we look at one another that way. Just to see that fear. Because, I mean, we've all traveled in other cultures, and sometimes, when you're in another culture and you stand out as the only person in a minority, it's kind of scary.
Well, then there are genetic or biological aspects that facilitate the identity formation. I remember some reports a couple of years back where some psychologists had identified that babies start identifying by skin color or other traits, people who are like them versus people who are not like them. And then now we're finding out that things like oxytocin are, neurotransmitters that affect our understanding or attachment to other people, not only individuals, but group-wise.
Oxytocin being basically the hormone of, I think it's called the love hormone, right?
That's one of the terms, yeah. But biologists, scientists have also identified that this so-called love hormone is a group identity hormone as well, in that people who, under testing, and if we accept the premises and conclusions of these tests, oxytocin is also involved in identification of the self as being part of a group. So oxytocin as a positive illicit or motivator would be elicited when you're confronted or visualize someone that you love, but then somebody who's like you, it's also elicited under those circumstances. So as a behavioral motivator or factor, there are biological aspects that promote at least in-group and out-group identification.
Well, that the big battle of nature versus nurture, after the Second World War, nature won out, and it stuck its head. Nature stuck its head back up in the 70s and early 80s with social biology, but it lost again. Nobody talks about the social biology aspects of who we are as humans. I do. I remember I talked to a student, this was in class 20 years ago, about social biology. And one of my students brought it up in her sociology class, and the instructor told her, don't talk about that in this class ever again. Nobody wants to talk about it because it scares people. I think going back to what you guys are asking with the future, to me, the biggest change in the future, when it's going to happen, is when genetic research finally begins to develop ways to pinpoint gene complexes and look at things like race, look at things like fear, and realize, that we're genetically programmed with some of these things, and that's who we are. I think that day's coming. I think it has to come because I think it's real. I mean, some of the best examples out there are with identical twins. I mean, there are plenty of cases with identical twins that were raised separately through adoptions. One I can remember, one was up in the East Coast and one was in the West Coast, and they're both 30 and they found each other. Well, they both married redheaded men. They both loved pizza the best. Both of their husbands had green eyes. The favorite bands were the Beatles. I mean, on and on and on. These people never knew one another. So I think, I think genetic studies of identical twins are big, and also phobias. Phobias are, every people in the world have phobias, not the same one. But, again, if you go back, fear of heights, fear of snakes, fear of enclosures, fear of water, all of those things were a threat to you early humans. Drowning, falling off cliffs, going into a cave. And so probably picked out the ones that could survive. And so those phobias are there. But people today have phobias for snakes and spiders. We don't know anybody that's really died from that. But we don't have phobias for atomic weapons or machine guns. But we have phobias for things that go back hundreds of thousands of years.
I live in the desert, and we have lots of snakes that are deadly around here. Sometimes they.
That's why it's good to have a phobia. That's why it's a good thing to have a phobia, because you'll be careful.
And it's been identified. I can't remember exactly which region. So the identification or elicitation of fear response to things like snakes, for example, is an inborn trait and characteristic. Again, so it's not really a phobia so much as what would it be? Taxis, or what's the opposite of a taxis? Taxis is toward, right? So the opposite of taxis.
Well,
I don't understand. What are you saying?
Think of a phobia as necessary for survival.
Yes.
That's phobia. If you think about a phobia, it's necessary for survival. So take it back to what its origins would be. Xenophobia would be necessary for survival, because you have to be careful of people that don't look like you, because they're the frickin' enemy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm interested in something that Rick said a little bit earlier. He said that he thinks that the culture of the South is not assimilating and disappearing, and I'd like to know more about that, because, as I said, I mean, right here in New Orleans, I feel, and I'm identified as like an alien from the past, a time traveling alien from the past, and that nobody on the next door app, for instance, every time somebody gets into an argument with me, they say, "Well, he supported the Confederate monuments. He's a racist."
Well, I'm not suggesting they're not out there, Charles. I'm not suggesting that at all. You've got an entire several generations of that. But I also know an awful lot of young people that don't feel that way. But
well,
again,
and I would also
they're
point
quiet.
out, racism and ethnicity are two different things. Just having an identity of who you are and rejecting people as not belonging to your in-group, whatever you want to call it, your ethnic group, that's not a phobia. That can be principled.
I'm not disagreeing with that. Ethnicity is totally different from race. That's not my point. My point is simply one on biology. I don't care what ethnic group you are or anything. I'm simply saying that for human evolution back 700,000 years ago, 500,000 years ago, when you're roaming the world in bands of 25 to 75 people, most everybody with you are your relatives, and you come across another human being that doesn't look like you or speaks another language, you got to put your antenna up, because you're in a survival mode for food.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's part of survival. So yeah, ethnic group is entire. There's no such thing as an ethnic phobia, I don't believe. I think there's xenophobia, which is other cultures, and mostly people that don't look like you. But we've never really drilled down to ethnic. I think the whole concepts, and I think our terms should focus on ethnism. I mean,
Well, and
really
so
what we talk about is ethnism.
yes, and the reason I bring that up, again, because of my own heritage, I come from places where there's not so much talk about racism, and there's a more emphasis on ethnicity and identity. So, someone can say, I'm French, or I'm British, or I'm Welsh, or Irish, or whatever, and those are identified as ethnicities. But in the U.S., this term race is thrown around without any consideration that there might be ethnic bases for the self-identification and the formation of groups based on racial characteristics, which can be part of a cultural element.
Sure. I mean, look at the immigrants that came in, the way the Irish were treated, the way the Germans were treated. You know, they belonged to the same race, but they were different ethnic groups, and they certainly had issues in terms of trying to assimilate the culture.
Well, and my larger point is, just because somebody might be, you know, there's this tendency to want to erase all identity other than the empire's, you know, the U.S. empire's identity, approved, officially approved identity. But yes, there's Southern identity. There are people who have white identity. There are people who have black identity. There are people who have Indian identity. And there are multiple Indian tribes, for example, each who have their own identities. And so I would argue we need to be careful in our language use to make sure that we are emphasizing what's really important, and that is cultural identity, I believe.
Well, do you equate white identity with cultural identity?
I would say that there are people who have a cultural identity that is constrained to people of certain heritage, i.e. white people. So there are physical characteristics, if that's what you want to call white, but physical characteristics don't exclude. It's culture that says this person's not is or is not part of my ethnic group. And
which goes back to ethnocentrism.
Yes. Yeah. I told you I'm an ethnocentrist. So
well,
I mean,
you know, if you drill down on ethnocentrism, you know, so many people of the tribal and band level, their word for themselves was humans. So when I was in Yap, it was Girdi Nuab, people of Yap. If you weren't a people of Yap, you were something called an Abichai. You were an outsider. Cheyenne means human. So that's the epitome of ethnocentrism, the word to describe yourself. The Jews are the chosen people. So yeah, you can look at ethnic groups and see how they do it, because ethnocentrism belongs to the ethnic group, not to the race.
Well, but that's my point, is a lot of what is classified as racism might be at least a nascent, if not an actual ethnic identity. You know, I deal with people who are very strongly identify themselves as white, but again, you know, just saying certain skin color, you know, skull shape, eye shape, whatever, that's not what they're talking about. They're talking about belonging to, you know, a nation or an ethnic group that is a subset of the larger racial group.
I agree.
So, I mean, again,
excuse me, guys. I just came out of pneumonia yesterday.
Sure. Oh, sorry to hear that. Hopefully, you're feeling better.
I'm alive. No, I think going forward, I think we should going back, Charles. I think we need to go back, because Ed just said it. I think we need to go back and embrace the concept of ethnic group. I think the future lies in talking about ethnic groups and abandon race, because race gets you nowhere.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I have personally abandoned the use of the term race for almost all dialogue. Only when I'm in conversation with people that's only understand, then you have to speak in their language. But we're cultural groups. I mean, I personally, you know, again, I'm ethnocentric. I'm a nationalist, and I say we are a nation and we have a culture, and you know, there are people who are not of our nation and not of our culture, and I believe we need to stress. I consider myself a nationalist. Another term I use for myself is culturalist, because I think culture is vital. Culture, to me, supersedes race. It includes race, perhaps, in terms of seeing race as a constituent component of one's identity. But that's ethnicity. That's not race or racism. Merely having an identity is not a racial characteristic.
Well, I've made the argument, and I will continue to make the argument, that in the antebellum United States, white Southerners were an ethnic group distinct from white Northerners. And I think I can support that.
And one of the political advocacies I've been making is that our side should start using some of these human rights laws to our benefit. Like, for example, there's statements, all peoples have a right to self-determination. We're a people, it starts with this self-identification and saying we are a people and we have a right to survive and a right to exist and to carry on our culture.
But Rick has just brought up an interesting point, and I, I have to say I worry a lot about it, because if Southerners are an ethnic group,
No, I said were. I said antebellum South. They were.
well, okay, but I mean, you don't think that there is a more radical difference between a Virginian and a Texan in 1860 than there is now?
Say that again. Was there more of a difference
I
in
mean,
1860 than now?
before the war in 1860, there was, I think, a greater difference between Virginians and Louisianans and Virginians and Texans and even Texans and Louisianans than between you just, if you amalgamate all those different Southern identities, every state had a different personality and a different culture, a focus. I mean, Louisiana was largely French in 1860. That vanished fairly quickly, but I mean, even court cases and legal reports were often conducted in French in the 1850s, and even afterwards. There were French language newspapers, and the lifestyle difference between Texas and Virginia was huge. And probably at least as, and I just don't know how you'd I mean, there's this group called the League of the South that talks about Southern nationalism, and I just wonder about it, and I think, does this make any sense at all if you compare Robert E. Lee to Sam Houston, or Jefferson Davis to Sam Houston, or Robert E. Lee? I mean, did they not have profound cultural differences? Tidewater, Virginia, was very different from Appalachian Virginia. You had much more in the way of regional diversity, is I guess what I'm saying, and the difference between Tidewater and upland was pronounced in the Carolinas and Georgia.
Absolutely, Charles. But I would come back with the concept of a culture area. I think that what was the Confederacy represents, in anthropological terms, a culture area, which means that within that culture area, the people have more in common with one another than they do with people outside that culture area. Just like when we divide up, in terms of archaeological, we talk about the Southeastern. Southeastern is very different than the Northeastern, yet in the Southeastern, you had all those variations. There's different climates, there's different soils, there's different kinds of things, but overall, the South in that period had more in common than they did with the Yankees up in the North. Of course, there's difference in the Tidewater. Of course, there's difference in Appalachia than Texas, but they still seceded, they still fought. They didn't own slaves. They just went in, do it. They saw themselves as different from the North, and the North saw them again as other. But I'm not trying to determine or even suggest that there's not difference in it. But again, I'll go back to what you and I learned in culture area. The culture area is only pure in the middle. It's not pure around the margins, but we still use it as somewhat of a way to classify. So I do think the South again represented what we would call a culture area, mostly Protestant. Historically agricultural, historically not that many immigrants, historically they were Episcopalians, Protestants mostly, very few Catholics, except down in Louisiana. So there was a lot of things that kept them together, quite different than up in the North. That's just my take on it.
It's interesting because basically if we try to use sort of an anthropological approach, what was it that made the South a unified area, other than what de Tocqueville called the peculiar institution, because that's really the only thing that I think Virginia and Texas had in common in 1860.
Most of those people from Texas came from the South to settle there. You know, they migrated. Jim Bowie came from Louisiana. The Crockett's, you know, they came from all over the South. Very few people.
We're having this problem.
Okay. I'll lean up again. I'm
Yes.
saying that Texas was settled mostly by Southerners. You didn't feel people from New Hampshire.
Largely by people from Tennessee. Actually, that was probably the largest single contributor.
There was, but like, you know, Louisiana people came over, people from the Carolinas, Kentucky. So they brought their with there. So I don't think this is radically different. You know, you have to adjust to the climate. The climate in Texas is quite different than the climate in Mississippi. But I think they brought with them a lot of their values. You know, Santa Anna said to people, you know, you can come to this land as long as we'll let you give you land, and we want two things. We want you to become Catholics, and we want you to learn Spanish. Well, all those people that migrated in from the South over there, they didn't learn Spanish and they didn't become Catholics. You know, so then Santa Anna was quite upset that he let in all those migrants because they didn't assimilate into their culture. So I do think there's a link, you know, between Texas and Virginia. There's more of a link between Texas and Virginia than there was Virginia and New Hampshire. I mean, I would just bet farm on that one.
Well, and I think that there were other cultural differences between the origins of the people towards the north versus in the south. My understanding is a lot of the South culture might have actually been Scotch, you know, Scots people, and they brought their cultural values and viewpoints with them, whereas a lot of the North were, you know, definitely English. And I think it was de Tocqueville, he said, you know, it looks like a country of Tories. So there were definite cultural trends, or let's say demographic trends, that resulted in very different cultural outlooks between the North and the South.
Totally. I mean, religion-wise, they're mostly, you know, Scotch-Irish, some English, but heavily Protestant. No long history of immigration in the South. You know, back when you could start getting into the 1800s, you know, slavery was, you know, New Jersey had slavery up until 1852. So slavery was everywhere. You had black code laws up there. You had exclusion laws. Illinois, Wisconsin, Oregon all passed laws that would not allow blacks into their states. So, you know, they all had that same kind of attitudes. You know, the South did have slavery, but again,
of course, Oregon was only admitted to the Union in 1859.
But it had, as a territory, it had exclusion laws that would not allow blacks to enter the territory.
Well, and my understanding is the Oregon Constitution, if you look at it, actually, I think to this day, says that only whites can be citizens. The California Constitution, it went through an iteration. The first iteration only allowed whites to be citizens, and then to be admitted into the Union, they had to rewrite their Constitution.
Well, you know, I just learned this recently, that many Northern politicians in Congress were very upset with Thomas Jefferson and Louisiana Purchase, because they were fearful that they would open up those territories to blacks and slavery, and that was supposed to be white man's territory. And that continued for a long time. One of the reasons, you know, when they were having all the debates about whether slavery would be extended, the New York Tribune, where Horace Greeley always talking about, this is for white people. They didn't want to bring blacks into the Western countries, just because it wasn't necessarily about slavery. They just did not want blacks there, just like Oregon didn't, Illinois didn't. Illinois had an exclusion law. It always upsets me when we think about, you know, Newport, Rhode Island was like the largest slave trading place in the country. But we only hear about New Orleans and we only hear about Charleston. Nobody ever brings up Newport.
No, there's an interesting connection between Rhode Island, and New Orleans, of course, affiliated with a particular family name. As a matter of fact, I assume you know which name I'm talking about, Rick.
Well, I know the family up in Newport, which was Lopez, but I assume that's not what you're talking about.
No, I'm talking about there's a couple blocks from where I live. There's something called the Two-Row Synagogue, and in Newport, Rhode Island, there's a Two-Row Synagogue that George Washington wrote a famous letter to, basically that is often cited as the foundation for Jewish integration into American society.
Okay, well my thing, Lopez, Aaron Lopez.
Okay.
Jewish slave trader from Newport, became the richest man in Rhode Island. He had 16 slave ships. He became the richest person in the entire state. He donated philanthropically. Nobody ever talks about Lopez. Nobody ever mentions him. I have, but he gets buried. He gets buried. Nobody ever heard of him. But we know about New Orleans, but we don't know about the slave trade up in Newport. I bet there's no plaques up there commemorating the slave and bringing him in on the ships. Now this guy he went to Africa and brought him back on his ships. The richest man, a Jewish slave trader. You never heard of his name.
Well, and I would like to point out, yes, absolutely, Rhode Island, all of the initial colonies definitely supported slavery, and in many cases they were supporting Indian slaves. They were both, well, primarily, I guess they were exporting them from there to other locations. I'd mentioned in a previous interview that I just finished a book on King Philip's War, and that came up in there that slavery was a key issue among that whole area with the Indians. So the Indians were supporting slavery because they practiced it, and the colonists were supporting slavery because they practiced it. It was just a normal kind of every country. And as I always point out, everybody seems to forget about the Ottoman Empire, and that was a severe threat to Europe, and it was an empire of slavery. So I'm not justifying slavery in Europe. All I'm saying is they were fighting against an empire of slavery, and if they didn't do something, they themselves stood to become slaves themselves.
Well, it's interesting. Emory University has the best resources, archives on the slave trade in the New World, and figures that when I saw shock one, so we don't believe that. I mean, we don't hear this. The number of Africans brought slavery into the colonies and into North America, 235,000. The number brought to Brazil, over 5 million.
Yeah.
The number brought to Jamaica, 3 million. We pale in terms of the numbers of slaves brought into what was the colonies and into North America compared to what happened in Brazil. 5 million in Brazil, 230,000 in the United States. We just don't go over those things. And the Indians, all of the quote unquote 5 civilized tribes, they all had black slaves, all of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
They brought them with them on the travelers, but very few people know that.
Yeah.
And in fact, what's interesting is the last place in North America where slavery was legal was in the Oklahoma Territory, because the 13th Amendment did not affect the Oklahoma Territory. So after the Civil War, Native Americans in Oklahoma continued to have their black slaves until it became a state.
And that population still exists. There's still an identifiable cultural and ethnic subgroup of blacks affiliated with the descendants of those slaves in Oklahoma.
Oh yeah.
They have a special status. All of this is really interesting because blacks are not even a monolithic ethnic group inside the United States. As you say, there are tremendous differences between northern blacks and southern blacks, or between South Carolina, Gullah, and New Orleans or Texas blacks. There are definitely cultural groups that have evolved. And so, I mean, I think that when Ed says that culture is prime, he's basically talking the truth. But as you say, the perception is race, and the thing that develops phobias and that causes people to identify us and them is basically the phenotype, and the skin based phenotype.
So I'd like to bring up a point on that basis, and that is that we're undergoing cultural warfare, and so the reason race is not allowed to be forgotten is because it's part of the program of a certain group of people, and communists. That, I mean, if you've read their literature, they explicitly said we don't have vast class differences in the United States, so therefore they can't. In communists and socialists couldn't engage in the same kind of class warfare, but there were racial divisions that they could focus on. And I would argue that's, I mean, if you look at all of the discussion and the dialogue and um, just general framing of issues, I believe most of them are, well, first of all, the primary source of that are the media itself and then educational institutions. It's through these ways that certain cultural ideas and framing of cultural issues are imposed. And again, most people they just go along with whatever's being talked about in the environment without trying to set a new course or new basis of discussion. And so, the Marxists are I mean, critical race theory. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from the Marxists. Cultural Marxism itself is an attempt to utilize cultural principles to destroy the opponents of Marxism. And so I think that we have to be aware of the importance of culture. And in fact, we've got to understand how to engage in cultural defense and cultural offense in order to promote and protect our interests.
You gotta know who the enemy is, and usually we don't, because they're often pretty good at hiding. I'll go back to New Orleans and the movement to take down the monuments. There was an organization. Well, I'll do two things here. When the BBC came and talked to me, they were at my house for a few hours, and that night we all met at the Jefferson Davis statue, which we were there probably every night. And in the paper that day, the newspaper talked about the group and said it was racial hostility between the groups. And I told the BBC people, I said, there's no racial hostility. And so that night, Antifa said that they were going to come. And so they got a great big old army truck, and they brought in a couple truckloads of people. So when the BBC got there, there were, I think, around 33, 34 people at the monument protesting not to take it down. And of those 33, 32 were white. There were about 130, 140 people on the other side of the street who were screaming to take him down. I counted those people. There were 17 blacks and about 125 whites. So I pointed out to the BBC, I said, it's not a black and white issue. Most everybody's white on both sides. It's young versus old. It was the Antifa and the Marxists versus the other ones.
Yeah.
And then the group Take 'Em Down New Orleans, the face of that was a black man named Malcolm Suber, who came to New Orleans from North Carolina. And when the court cases all started, I went to court every day, and there was this woman with Suber and some of the Take 'Em Down people, white woman. And I dug on this woman. Who was this woman? She's always there. And I finally found out her name was Gabriella Gemma. And it turns out that Gabriella Gemma is, she moved here. She moved to New Orleans from Long Island, where she was a rebel rouser for unions. And all of a sudden she appears in New Orleans, and she's from Long Island. She's a registered member of the Communist Party, as Malcolm Suber are. And she founded the New Orleans Workers' Party. I've got pictures of her at Xavier University, a black university, where she's standing up addressing the audience behind a hammer and sickle and Russian phrases in Russian language. What an odd combination. And then I went and did research with the Louisiana State Department to find out that Take 'Em Down New Orleans was registered as an organization of business. And who are the two presidents? The white Jewish woman from New York and the black man from North Carolina, both of them card-carrying Marxist. What a weird combination. But nobody ever found about this. I gave this to the press. I gave it to everybody. Nobody would touch it. That's who the enemy is. You got to figure out who they are. They're behind the scenes pulling all the buttons.
And you have to understand how they fight. And that's one of the things that, so by their own usage, the term dialectic warfare or dialectic materialism, whatever you want to call it. And another key term, which I learned in reading the leftist literature, is this concept of framing. And framing is setting up the debate terms so that you have a thesis, a synthesis, a thesis, an antithesis, and from that you get a synthesis. So the bigger point is our side is actually not very well versed in, let's say, cultural warfare, in ideological warfare, and that's what our enemies are engaging in. And we have to understand these terms. We have to understand these ideas. We have to understand how to fight them. It's easy to say, there's a Fed or a red under the bed or whatever, and oh my gosh, let's all be afraid. I'm not saying that. I'm saying know your enemy and know how they fight, and understand how to combat them or to deal with them. And it's going to be an ideological war, because that's what they're doing.
You were mentioning the other night, you were talking about Jacques Derrida and I believe Foucault also, and that basically we need to master the linguistics and the language of dialogue, and how to frame these issues. I think that's exactly what we need to do to fight back. But how can we? How do we have today enough unity of beliefs to actually say what our synthesis, our thesis, antithesis, and synthesis will be?
Well, I mean, it's always got to be, you're dealing with and responding to, usually, and I'm not saying we should always be reactive. Sometimes we have to be proactive, and we have to identify what it is that we stand for. That's one of the reasons I take the approach. Like I said, I rarely ever talk about race, because they've controlled the terminology. And if you use their terminology, you're just entering into their fight. So I believe that's why I think describing things in terms of culture and ethnicity, these are all, this changes the dialogue. It changes the narrative, so to say, that another term that they tend to use. So they are engaged in narrative warfare as well. And we have to understand that the only way we're going to fight them off, they're a small group who is not well accepted by the population, I would argue, but they have, if you understand from their own literature, infiltration and subversion of institutions is their key mechanism. And so they've infiltrated, for example, most of the media, and they've infiltrated most of the educational institutes, and thereby they control what gets taught and what people hear and think about. And we have to think for ourselves what's important to us. Is, you brought up the term ethnocentrism. I came to the conclusion, and it was transformative for me, to say tribalism is good. Ethnicity is good. We have to embrace these things. And it for me, it was it definitely lightened the load, so to say, because now I understand, what are our opposition trying to do? And so in answer to your question, one of the things is understand what they themselves write. And so for the left, they were entirely economic determinists until Gramsci, an Italian communist called Gramsci, came along, and he kind of wrote a folk sociology, I would say, but it helps Marxists understand culture and how to modify and adapt it. Our side doesn't necessarily have anything equivalent. So most of our people, don't understand culture and sociology. And so from Gramsci, then you end up with the Frankfurt School. And eventually you end up, with postmodernism like Derrida and Foucault. Again, I would like to emphasize Derrida is quoted as saying, and let's focus where the emphasis is on language. Derrida says that he wanted to make it impossible for Europeans to think positively about their own culture, and so through the manipulation of language, that was the weapon that he used. So if we are to be successful, we have to understand that the opposition are going to use ideas against us. And on the one hand, we have to be strong and firm and know what ideas are our own and what are the enemy's ideas, and deal appropriately. It's just not something that most people are ready to deal with. Maybe an anthropologist or a sociologist is, but your average person who's been educated in American public schools has zero understanding of how ideas influence culture.
Well, when I invited Rick to join us tonight, we talked briefly about the complete infiltration and takeover of anthropology. And I guess I'd like to invite Rick to talk a little bit about that right now, because, you know, the 19th century anthropology was basically a WASP undertaking. As a matter of fact, Tulane, when I got there in the mid 70s, seemed like basically a WASP. The department was basically a WASP department, and those features don't apply anymore.
Okay, I'll do that. I'm going to go back to Ed first, and then I'll come back. I agree with you 1,000%. We're not ready for the battle. Joseph Conrad said, "Give me the right word, and I can conquer the world." And I think that's what the left does. They use the words very effectively, very effectively. And so I think the only way we can combat is to get involved with K through 12 education. And I think that movement started pretty strongly in Virginia and in Florida and in California as well. Parents need to get involved. They started seeing what their kids are being taught, and they're starting to rebel. And I hope that continues, because you can't change anything as long as they're getting fed all of this stuff. My brother is in Virginia, in the most conservative counties in Virginia, Hanover. His two grandchildren, two boys. He was talking to the younger one, who was 7, and he was talking about a time machine. This just happened 2 weeks ago. He called me and told me, told his grandson, he says, "If I could go back in a time machine, I want to go back during the time of Tyrannosaurus Rex and see what they really look like." And his 7-year-old said, "Well, Papa, I like to go back to the time of Columbus so I could tell him not to do what he did so all those Indians wouldn't be killed." 7 years old.
Yeah.
That's where the problem lies. We got to tackle it at its base. Now, going back to anthropology. Franz Boas, German Jew who was a physicist, immigrates to the United States. Is considered, the founding father of anthropology. Started up at Columbia. Well, in the late 19th century, the Jewish immigrants in New York were seen as being not very smart, looked down upon, not as intelligent as white people. He writes about this. And of course, it influences him to look and to see that, it's not biology, it's culture. So he dedicated his lifetime to building a field, creating all kinds of students and leaders who decided everything is culture. He took on people who said it was nature and fought that war. He directed his primary student, who became the most famous anthropologist in the world, Margaret Mead, to go into the field, because at that time, there was this idea, there was a lot of publications and talk about teenagers rebelling against their parents, not listening and rebelling. And so people just thought it was puberty. And Boas, no, I really think it's culture. And so he sent Margaret Mead into the field to prove that it was culture. So she goes to Samoa, stays there only a few months, comes back and writes a book called Coming of Age in Samoa that comes out in the late 20s. It's got little sexual things in it. It became a bestseller. And the last time I've always checked it. It's in the top 10 selling books in the world, has been for generations. And it's what she said. Oh, of course, no, these kids, they get along well with their parents, you know, they don't rebel, they don't do this, they don't do that. And so then began the battle that it's all culture. Culture, 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 and biology just took her back. But now we've seen that Boaz just manipulated her and most of the students, and that's what they came up because anthropology distinguished themselves from all of the other sciences and social sciences that we study culture. Nobody else does. Biologists look at biology, political science look at the political systems, economics, but we look at culture, the whole thing, because that's what makes us human. And one of Boaz's colleagues, Alfred Kroeber, coined the term culture was the super organic. It's above life. And that's how the education system then came about. We can be anything. Racism is culture, you know, how you're brought up is culture, poverty is culture, gun violence is culture, everything is culture. Nothing has to do with biology or genetics, nothing. And we can overcome it through education. So we're going to educate people. Well, you know, you're not a racist because you're born that way. You're a racist because you were taught that way from your parents. So let's re-educate you the way you are. So I think anthropology just led us down an entire path for 100 years, the entire 19th, the entire 20th century. And we're dealing with the residuals of it. And it's just gotten worse because at least some of the things that anthropology stood for, which is cultural relativity, modernists throw it out the window. Ethnocentrism, throw it out the window. And I think it's been a disservice. I'm embarrassed at what happened. When I teach my classes and there's younger people teaching, I'm just shocked at some of the things my students hear and see. It's 100% culture. It's just nothing else. Nothing. And
well, it's
Boaz
which culture? It's which
Pardon?
culture? It's which culture, right? And so they're not being brought up with their own culture. They're being brought up with this Marxist or globalist
Yes.
viewpoint.
Yes.
But also, I think it just bears emphasizing that people who've gone back and looked at Samoa and looked in particular at, the crime statistics, for instance, in Samoa, and the family violence and everything else, everything that Mead said was basically a lie.
Yes.
She made it all up. And yet by the Boaz had this ritual of sending people out into the field, but there was no way of verifying any of it, and it just she wrote a myth. Basically, another anthropologist, Marshall Solons, coined the phrase "historical metaphors and mythic realities." Margaret Mead created a historical metaphor in Samoa of the mythic reality that she wanted to create, and that is basically a key focus of the kind of analysis I think we need to be doing here in the United States of the trajectory we're on.
Well, and I think the answer, therefore, I mean, and anthropology does give us some insight into what's going on and how we move out of it, I would believe. And that is, how does a society form itself? And it does it through, yes, its norms, its values, its institutions, and the infrastructure and culture of the people. And so we know that our opposition has engaged in a century-long infiltration and subversion operation. And what we're going to have to do is either one, we're going to have to re-infiltrate those institutions and have them embrace our culture, or we're going to have to reject those institutions and build new institutions that, again, teach our culture.
And how do we do
that?
that?
Would be education.
Education, absolutely. So one of the ways is, and you're seeing it, is homeschooling. People are basically rejecting the institutions themselves and forming smaller family-based institutions, or even in my town here, the homeschooling movement is actually very organized. highly organized and structured, and you know, they get together where almost normal class size, and they'll go out and they'll do field trips and such. But so that's how you're going to have to do it. What are the institutions that they have infiltrated that they use against us? Well, it's media, it's education, it's government, and I believe that the only way we're going to do that is, on the one hand, like I said, you know, you either got to re-infiltrate and re-subvert those to embrace your culture, or you develop alternative institutions. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
You say that, and I always tell this story to people when I'm talking to I always forget the gentleman's name, Sergoyev or something like that, but the Russian KGB agent that defected to the United States in the late 60s.
Oh, I know
he's still on he's still on YouTube. You know, when he was asked the question, this was 1969, 70, 71, will the Soviet Union invade the United States? And he very quickly said, no, we will not invade the United States with the military. We already are invaded your educational systems where they're teaching Marxism. And we're ready for the day it will take 30 to 40 years before we're finished. And when we're finished, you'll have teachers who's teaching other teachers who's teaching children cultural Marxism. And there will be a revolt in the United States. And it will be between generations. And then the Soviet Union will come in and clean it up. Well, you certainly hit the nail on the head with the 30 to 40 years and infiltrating the education system, because they did.
But the Soviet Union has gone kind of in a different direction.
Of course they did, but that's not the point. The point is that at that time, in the late 60s, this is what their goal was, and they infiltrated our education system. I told you that Franz Boas was a card-carrying communist.
See, that is fascinating. I mean, that was. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but I am surprised that nobody ever discussed that, to my knowledge, anywhere in anthropology, graduate school or undergraduate. And so, when did you find out? You said you found it out by doing a FOIA request for Franz Boas' FBI file, right?
That's right. Because when you read the paper that I sent you, you'll see that I have an FBI and a CIA file. So I knew about getting stuff.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, I mean, I wanted everybody to get to know you. If I can get you back, I'm going to introduce you to Sam Dixon, and I think there'll be some very interesting dynamics there, because he talks about the infiltration of the legal system by Bolsheviks, and Felix Frankfurter apparently was a genuine communist, the first Jewish justice on the Supreme Court. And so, I mean, when you think about the formation of basically the life of the 20th century America being led by Jewish communists, Felix Frankfurter in law, Franz Boas in anthropology, and I mean, obviously the Federal Reserve, of course, a totally different subject, with the Schiff and Warburg families, framing the banking industry. Where do we? I mean, is homeschooling really going to do it, or do we need to start? Do we need to try to somehow try to take back the universities?
I don't think you can take back. I think you have to take the universities from the bottom up. I don't think you can do anything. They're too entrenched in the system. I think homeschooling is a great start, but I think getting involved with the school systems for those people that can't homeschool and can't afford charter schools, private schools, that they've got a better idea of what's going on in the curriculum. And I do think you see that going on, but I don't think you can change the universities. You know, when I was involved with Monty stuff, history professor asked me to come over and talk to the class. It was a seminar on the Civil War, so I did. I spent an hour and 45 minutes with them. And I couldn't believe some of the things they told me. They told me that because one student, a female student, said that because Robert E. Lee was such a good general, it's because of him that an additional 300,000 people died. That was a weird statement. I won't go back to my office, and the professor sent me an email and says, Rick, thanks for coming to class today. It was good to give the students a different perspective. And I thought to myself, that's what you're supposed to do. You know, it's just, I think it's hopeless, Charles. I don't think you can.
Who is this professor?
Huh?
Who is this professor? Who is this professor?
In the history department. I'm not going to go into naming, but you know, anytime there's the revolutions, you know, in South America, you know, who did they always arrest and kill first? You know, but the professors. And the same thing with Mao. I mean, there's a reason that they go in and clean out. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. I think it's got to come from the bottom up.
Well, and I think another important concept, again, maybe either out of sociology or anthropology, is that of authority. So a society has elites who have authority, and because of the infiltration, our authorities don't really represent us anymore. And so I believe we have to establish our own authorities, and we have to reject the authority of people who do not accept and embrace our culture. It's not hard to do. You know, that's how it's done. That's how they're doing it to us. So they are attacking our authorities. You know, what's the Marxist line on someone like Thomas Jefferson? Or what's the Marxist line on someone, well, anybody. And they'll say, well, they're a capitalist and they are oppressors or whatever. You know, those are not happy terms. They're denigrating and deauthorizing or delegitimizing these authorities so that they can replace them with our own. We have to do the same to them. First, identify bad ideas and bad idea propagators and just label them as bad. They don't represent us, and reject them. And then on the other hand, go ahead.
That goes back to what you were talking about, framing.
I'm sorry?
That goes back to what the concept you were talking of, framing.
Yeah. Authority is its own. So one of them, and this kind of gets back to, you know, you and I have talked about the issue of language and how it affects cognition. Framing is an issue that affects cognition, and it uses language. But authority is a key concept. So, you know, I took an anthropology class, or a couple of them, and sociology classes, you know, and I remember from one class, you know, they said that every society is constantly struggling to identify and define who it is, and bring about meaning within that society. And it's through symbols and values and assignment of value to particular ideas as being important, and also establishing authorities or elites who embrace the ideas of that society to carry it forth. Well, in our case, our society's leaders, the leaders that proclaim themselves to be our leaders, they don't recognize us, or they don't represent us. So we have to refuse to recognize their authority and their legitimacy to define our culture and identity for us. So anyway, it's slightly different. Framing relates to, if you want, it is the act of creating a dialectic for the purposes of dialectic warfare or whatever. Again, for me, it was a new term and new idea. But then once you start understanding what they mean by framing, then you're going, oh, that's what they're doing. Basically, they want to, and this is my personal experience and part of how I how I combat what they're trying to do. What they want to do is they want to instill ideas and attitudes in people. And the way that they do that is by creating a negative association with the concepts that we're all familiar and happy and know are part of our culture. So, I mean, a typical example that I like Trump. I'm not a big, I don't like him in all ways, but I liked him. And then whenever I heard his name in the media, I kind of cringed, and I realized for myself, why am I cringing? It's like a Pavlovian response that they've created, that they've denigrated the concept or symbol of Trump to the point where I automatically have a negative association with it. And so part of what I believe we as a people need to do is build up positive associations with our cultural components. And the only way we're going to do that is by controlling them, creating controlled environments where people can hear about their history, hear about their culture, experience the music or dance or whatever in positive circumstances. And then they can really understand their own culture without this negative association that the enemy is always trying to impose on us. And most people, again, are not sophisticated enough to understand that they're being manipulated by cultural through language, and to fight it. That's how I believe we have to do it. So yes, homeschooling or creating new schools. That's one aspect of it. We also have to have our own media, which we have right here, which communicates our culture and our viewpoints and values in a very positive way, and also denigrates the opposition, which we're doing. This is the way that cultural warfare is waged.
I lost you guys for a few minutes, and I had to reload. Did something happen?
Not that we know of. We saw you were gone, but you once were lost, but now you're found.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was talking into it. You know, Ed and Charles. You know, I look at the country. I look at our political system. I look at what we call democracy. I don't think democracy can work in a country as diverse as us with as many people 50-50. It's a 50-50 split no matter what you do. And it's dysfunctional. So I don't know how we do it. So you got a situation where in the summer of 20, billions of dollars of rioting, damage, people killed, federal buildings, nobody arrested, nobody, nothing. Capitol Police, Capitol, 900 people in jail, 1,200 people arrested. That's where the authority is. And how do you overcome that? I mean,
well, and so I'm seeing that. I mean, I look in people that I deal with every day. People are kind of going, the people up there, they're not doing the right thing. They don't represent us. And I think that's one of the ways in discussion and communication with people, we emphasize that point that these people that are there don't represent us and aren't doing the right things. And so that's part, again, I think of cultural and ideological warfare, which the opposition is waging against us, and we have to understand how to fight it back. So why, what's the guy's name? There's a YouTube guy, James Lindsay. Are you familiar with him? I highly recommend checking out James Lindsay. It's New Discourses. He is an academic who specializes in anti-communism, and he talks about, one, their ideas, and two, their methods, and he also talks about how you counter their methods. So he's an excellent academic source of how we've got to deal with this opposition. He studied their idea.
The Marxification of education.
Is that a particular video?
Yeah, no, it's a book. I entered the name James Lindsay, and that's what came up. Marxification of education. Paulo Freire critical.
It's possible. I'm not familiar with his books. I just see his YouTube videos. But he has personal experience, and yes, he has written and he speaks regularly about these. So if as a source to understanding how we've got to move forward, I think he has some excellent perspective and some good ideas. I think we need more than that, but it's a good beginning to understand how the opposition works and what they're trying to do. So in the bigger picture, so they call it direct action, the Marxists. So why were they rioting? Again, it is part of their activism and in line with their ideas, and it is attacking the authority and putting pressure on people to align with their viewpoints. So if somebody does not support them, then like yourself, you dared speak out in a cultural viewpoint, they're going to send their goons out to silence you through intimidation. And and that's just how they work. That's how they've always worked. It's, you know, again, if I highly recommend checking out James Lindsay's videos. They're very academic. You may have trouble understanding them, but they're worth understanding the ideas he's talking about. So what they're trying to do is silence any voice that speaks any view that they don't like. And additionally, as part of that activity, like, for example, the forming of a chaz or some little region, is to establish that they themselves reject the authorities and can become the authorities. So again, that's also part of a cultural warfare, if you want, or an ideological warfare that they're engaging in. And we have to understand that and be able to deal with it.
But when you understand it, you understand their power.
Yeah.
Which is greater than ours. And that's why there's people so afraid. I mean, I can't tell you how many people, I'll never know the answer to this. How many people talked with me and said, you would never be doing what you're doing if you didn't have tenure. And, I don't want to believe that's true, but it was true in a sense, because, yeah, I felt pretty comfortable in doing what I did because I had tenure.
Yeah.
When I came back to Tulane, the woman who just now became the president of Hofstra, who was the president at Loyola, that time she was the special assistant to the president of Tulane. And when I came back after my sabbatical, she called up my new dean and said, why is he back? She said, because he has tenure. She said, that's too bad. So,
wow.
She's a Marxist creep, would be my viewpoint. Who is she to be making a decision like that? I mean, it's one thing they haven't. Go ahead.
And if she's actually an official, why would she not know? This is fascinating.
So historically, I mean, there are historical examples of people who have risen up and fought off communists. I mean, obviously, the Italians, the Germans, the Spaniards, the Croatians, and there are particular techniques and methods that they used to rise up and fight them, because how do you deal with Marxist direct action? Well, their action is with counter direct action. They don't want to, it's not about discussion or learning or respecting you or respecting cultures. It's a hostile struggle session is what they call it. I mean, so they're trying to impose social power on you so that you will back down and you won't speak out. And go ahead.
You say that they are trying to impose social power on you. So you're saying that they're asserting authority without having it? Is that what you're saying?
No. They're well, on the one hand, they assume they have that authority already. That's what Marxism is all about, is rejecting capitalist culture. That was also, like I mentioned, what was his name? Gramsci. He talked about, how the battle had to be conducted. And so on the one hand, yes, they're trying to attack any authority that voices an opinion that they don't like. They're trying to create an environment of fear where anybody is afraid of the violence that they threaten with. And most people are risk aversive. They're not prepared to deal with the kind of threats that these people bring. And so most people just back down. Right.
Because they don't have tenure. That's where Rick had he had authority and position on his side for sure.
He was lucky. You were lucky, Rick. On the one hand, you stuck to your guns. You know your own ideas, and you understand the importance of ideas. So you can battle them, whereas your average person's not prepared to deal with the kind of social stresses that these people want to impose on you. I disagree with you that they have a lot of power. It's very focused. They're able to get together. How many people did they bring to your school? Was it 110, I think you said, or something?
No, that was to the monument. Yeah, that was 130 people. Yeah.
So that's what they could bring to you. Don't you think if they could have brought 200 people, they would have? So
yes.
They have limits as well. 100 seems like a lot to you when you're standing alone, but so I mean, it's worth considering from an anthropological perspective that here you are. I don't know what the term is in anthropology or sociology, but you're somebody who's picked out as being a non-believer of their religion, and they're going to put pressure on you, and they're going to put pressure on all of the people around you to reject either you or the ideas that you are promoting. And again, most people are just not prepared to deal with even 10 people, doing a sit-in or something.
When I was a side story, I got an invitation to go to Trump's inauguration up in DC. So my son and I went up there, and that day, we were there all day and left, and we're going to get on the subway. So we were down waiting for a subway, and these two guys, one with the big camera, came over and started talking. Did you go there? I said, yeah. So I'm Trump supporter. You are. So he started talking to me. He said, and I told him, I said, you have a PhD in cultural anthropology, and you're a dean at Tulane University, and you work with the tribal people, and you support Trump. How could that be? How could that be? So he got on the subway with me and his friend and talked with me, and they missed their stop. He was just flabbergasted that somebody that was educated with the PhD and all this stuff could possibly support Trump, because they were there to show, we were all, anybody that supported that monuments were supposed to be Southern people with missing teeth, and all this kinds of stuff. And I was on HLN on CNN being interviewed, and after there was supposed to be 15 minutes, and after 5 minutes, they said, thank you very much, and cut the line. Because, they were trying to portray anybody that supported the monuments as some kind of a Southern hick. So I encountered an awful lot of people. I encountered Antifa several times in my life up in DC and everything. They were very effective at what they did.
Yeah,
and they still are.
They're experts and trained at what they do. Most people,
And
again,
they're
not
highly organized. My son Daniel looked at videos of Antifa in Florida, in California, in DC, in New York, and what he saw in those videos, that they all had the same megaphones made by the same company.
Yes.
That's organization.
Yeah. Well, and they have a lot of time. That's what they do. They sit there and they plan, what's our next event? Let's train for it. They train for these things. They train how to put pressure. If you notice, a lot of times they will not touch you with their hands when they're trying to put pressure on you. They'll hold their arms back and they'll push you with your chest. And again, most people are risk aversive and want to avoid confrontation and feel very uncomfortable with that kind of behavior. And so most people back down. It's just the way that they've learned how to push human emotion buttons, and they do it. They do it as professionals and experts.
They do.
And I mean, I don't want to state the obvious, or I don't even want to, they're creeps. They're anti-American. They don't believe in free speech. They never have. They never will. When they say they do, they're lying. They'll jump. I'm sorry.
At that monument that night at the Jefferson Davis, there was an older lady in a wheelchair, senior citizen. She had a little American flag. One of the Antifa girls, white girl, comes over. They get into a verbal argument, and the Antifa girl takes out pepper spray and sprays it in that old lady's face in a wheelchair.
Yeah. I mean, that's a felony, but again, most people don't realize that.
Well, the police were not the police were not very effective against Antifa. As a matter of fact, what was the name of the assistant mayor who was riding around with Antifa at that point?
I know who you're talking about. I don't remember his name. Yeah, he was with him.
The assistant mayor
they were mostly Tulane students and Loyola students and some UNO students. That's who Antifa was. Totally college students. Everywhere they are, there's college students. You don't find Antifa anywhere except where you have some major universities.
Yeah. They have to travel from one area to the other, and they have money. They'll if they don't already own a bus, they'll rent one, and they'll come out in buses. It's a professional operation, and most people just don't think that that's the kind of people we're up against.
Yeah.
but it is. And so it's going to take a new kind of preparation and operation on our part to be able to deal with that. Again, James Lindsay outlines techniques to deal with that. Again, I can highly recommend his videos. There's another guy who works with him. I can't remember his name right now. But so I highly recommend understand your enemy and know how they fight, and then you can fight back. But if you don't understand your enemy, then you're not prepared to deal with it.
Right. I agree.
What is our myth? What is going to be the unifying philosophy that's going to be able to turn things around? Or is it possible? Because I mean, you started off by talking about the prophet of the lost cause, and you mentioned the rise and fall of the Confederate government. You know, Jefferson Davis's rather weighty 3-volume set. You know that it would be great if people would read the whole thing, but it's fairly ponderous reading. It doesn't. It's not very suitable for the Instagram X world, and I'm not sure that his message is feasible anymore. So what?
Oh no.
What is the feasible message that we can say that will that could even potentially turn things around?
Give you one, just thinking cold. In New Orleans, Tulane University, I knew some students personally who were part of a group across the country that did the same thing. They put stickers around that said simply, "It's okay to be white." It's okay to be white. Well, Tulane just went crazy. They had to bring in counselors to work with students that were just so terrorized by it. It's okay to be white. That's all it said. It's okay to be white. And they went bananas. So maybe that's the theme, because it's certainly not aggressive. Which you don't mean it as aggressive, but people take it. It's just that it's okay to be white. Same difference, that happened with Black Lives Matter. Then all of a sudden you're a racist if you said all lives matter. That seems to get to people. All lives matter. But I like the idea it's okay to be white.
Yeah,
because it seems to be threatening.
It is to them.
It seems to be threatening and undermining some thoughts. And it's so simple. It's so easy. There's no violence in it or anything.
I mean, I'd like to answer your question, and I'm going to put it forth like that. Here's the myth that I think that will define who we are and how we have to move forward. We are a people, a nation united by our common heritage, culture, and destiny, and we have to fight to survive and prosper. That's what I would say is a myth.
But then define, we are a people. Who are we?
The people who believe that. It's a cultural component, right? So you either believe that or you don't. And the people who do will be motivated by that idea, by that myth, to action. Right? So culture is composed of cultural components, mores, values, and ethics and doctrine. And so we have to tell people what that doctrine or what that viewpoint is. And for me, that is the doctrine or viewpoint that I think is vital to moving us forward. Accepting that we are a people, accepting that we are a nation, accepting that we have rights, and that we have responsibilities to maintain and sustain and promote and move forward into a better future.
We're almost out of time, Rick. You have the last words here.
That's last words. I'm more of a pessimist in that sense. I don't think the United States is the way it was founded, with states that are united, but what we are today with 51 states. I don't see it existing in 50 years. I think it's too fractured. I think the only way to be able to go forward is going to be a fractured country where we, the people, and as you just said, are able to live in one place in harmony and pursue their ideals and pursue their goals. But in a society that's divided 50-50, that's becoming more and more unlike how we were founded, I just don't know how it's ever going to work, minus, some kind of a revolution. It doesn't have to be a physical, violent revolution, but certainly spiritual revolution or some prophet coming forward to leading people. I don't know. So I am a pessimist in a way. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, it's a good beginning. And Rick, I want to thank you so much. Ed, I want to thank you for joining me again. And Rick Marksbury, I really hope we'll be able to get you back on here. There are a lot of people in this community I'd like you to meet and interact with. And that's it for tonight, Speak Free Radio. And I always say, this is the flying, Richard Wagner's Flying Dutchman. They're sailing off into unknown medium.
It was nice meeting you, Ed, and listening to you. We couldn't about authority. I guess the authority lies with the shadow man.
Yeah,
I think the audio's going out over here.
Good night, Rick. Thank you very much.
Nice meeting you, Rick.
All right, Charles, Ed. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
W.B. Clark of Indiana, and in his book I found a very interesting sentence. He said, "I never saw a case of cancer in an unvaccinated person." Now, he wrote this in 1936. So to me, that was quite a revelation, and other doctors have said the same thing, that vaccination is really a time bomb within the human system that can go off 5 years, 10 years, 40 years after the end of the vaccination. You can have this time bomb go off. You can have a stroke, a heart attack, because it's always there in your system. You never get rid of it, and apparently it's always an alien force in your physique.
You're listening to Speak Free Radio, the free speech internet radio platform.